The air was thick with the scent of burning incense and the rhythmic pounding of war drums. In the heart of the kingdom of Zuberi, warriors gathered, their spears gleaming under the rising sun. Femi stood among them, tall and commanding, his dark skin glistening with sweat. His wife, Yara, watched him from the steps of their hut, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and dread. "Return to me, my love," she whispered, clutching his hand as he prepared to leave. "I will, Yara. I promise," Femi said, pressing his forehead to hers. His voice was steady, but the weight of battle loomed over him. The warriors marched away, their chants fading into the distance. Yara stood rooted to the spot, watching until the last glint of Femi's armor disappeared beyond the trees. Then, silence. A silence that stretched for weeks, then months. At first, Yara busied herself with daily chores, finding solace in the company of village women. But as the days dragged on, loneliness crept in, filling the empty spaces Femi had left behind. She wandered the market aimlessly, her eyes lingering too long on forbidden faces. Then she met him, Lerotto. He was different from Femi, not a warrior but a man of words and wealth. His eyes held mischief, his smile was quick, and he spoke to Yara in a way that made her forget the ache of waiting. "It must be hard," Lerotto said one evening as they stood beneath the baobab tree. "Being alone for so long." Yara hesitated. "It is, but I am a wife first. My husband will return." Lerotto chuckled, stepping closer. "And until then? Will you let the nights remain cold?" A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Then, a decision. As the weeks passed, the affair began, secret meetings under the moonlight, whispered promises that carried no real weight. They thought they were careful, that no one saw. But Imani did. The kingdom's gardener, a quiet man with rough hands and watchful eyes, had always harbored a silent affection for Yara. He noticed the glances, the way Yara laughed more when Lerotto was near, the stolen touches when no one was looking. His heart clenched with each passing day, a storm building within him. One evening, as he tended to the plants near Yara's hut, he heard hushed voices. He peeked through the leaves and saw them, Yara and Lerotto, wrapped in each other's arms. Imani's grip on the gardening shears tightened. His beloved Yara, betraying the warrior who had given his life to protect them all. Something inside him shifted. A dangerous seed was planted, and in the quiet darkness of his heart, it began to grow. The village of Zuberi stirred with excitement as the warriors returned, their banners high and their chants echoing through the air. The people gathered at the gates, eager to welcome their protectors home. Drums thundered, voices cheered, and the scent of roasted meats filled the air in celebration. Femi rode at the front, his armor dull with dust but his presence as commanding as ever. His dark eyes searched the crowd, yearning for one face. Then he saw her. Yara stood in the distance, draped in a flowing red wrap, her golden bangles catching the sunlight. She smiled, but Femi noticed something strange, it did not reach her eyes. His heart twisted. Had she missed him at all? Yara stepped forward as he dismounted, her fingers brushing his arm. "Welcome home, my love," she said softly. Femi held her gaze, searching for warmth, for longing. But there was something else. A distance. A hesitance. He nodded, masking his disappointment. "I have returned, Yara." That night, the village feasted. Fires crackled, warriors recounted tales of their victories, and the air was thick with laughter. Yet, Femi remained silent. He stole glances at Yara, watching how she moved, how she spoke. She laughed too easily, her gaze flickering toward a man seated a few tables away, Lerotto. Femi had seen him before. A merchant, charming but unremarkable. Yet something about the way Yara's eyes met his made the warrior's stomach churn. A suspicion bloomed in his chest. The next few days were filled with subtle betrayals. Yara no longer lingered by Femi's side as she once had. She avoided his touch, her voice careful, measured. Femi began watching. Observing. One evening, he returned home early from the training grounds. As he approached the hut, he heard hushed voices inside. A man's voice. Femi's muscles tensed. Slowly, silently, he stepped closer. Yara's soft laughter. Then, you shouldn't be here, Leroto. A pause. Then Leroto's voice, low and smooth. You didn't say that last night. Silence. Femi clenched his fists, his breath shallow. A blade of pain sliced through his chest, deeper than any wound he had ever suffered in battle. He could storm inside. He could demand answers. He could cut Leroto down where he stood. But he did nothing. Instead, he turned and walked away, his heart heavy as stone. For days, Femi carried the weight of betrayal in silence. He spoke little, trained harder, and lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Yara slept beside him, oblivious. He would not confront her. He would not stain his honor. But someone had seen. Imani. The gardener had watched from the shadows, his hands trembling with rage. He had worshipped Yara from afar, had loved her in silence. And yet, she had given herself to another while her husband, the great warrior, had been away fighting for her. Imani's devotion twisted into something darker. Something dangerous. He would not let this stand. He would make her pay. The night was thick with silence, the kind that draped over the village like a heavy cloak. The air was humid, the scent of earth and lingering embers from dying fires hanging in the breeze. Yara lay in her chamber, her body relaxed in sleep, unaware of the shadow that moved outside her window. A storm had been brewing within Imani for weeks, growing stronger each time he saw her smile at Leroto, each time he saw Femi suffer in silence. His love for Yara had turned into something unrecognizable, a twisted obsession, an unbearable rage. He could not stand it anymore. Tonight, it would end. Imani moved with the careful grace of a hunter. He had studied the house, knew its creaks and weaknesses. The door was slightly ajar, swaying with the wind. It was almost as if fate had welcomed him inside. Inside, Yara stirred in her sleep. A flicker of movement, the soft sigh of shifting sheets. Imani hesitated. For a moment, the woman he had loved so deeply looked peaceful, untouched by sin. But then he remembered. The stolen kisses, the laughter shared with another man. The betrayal. His grip tightened around the blade. A single step forward. Then another. Yara's eyes fluttered open. Too late. A muffled gasp. A quick struggle. Then, silence. The night swallowed the deed whole, leaving only the whisper of wind through the trees. By dawn, the village awoke to a scream that shattered the morning peace. Yara was dead. The village gathered outside Femi's home, murmurs thick in the air like gathering storm clouds. Warriors stood with tense shoulders, elders whispered among themselves, and the women clutched their wraps tightly around their shoulders. Femi stood motionless. His face betrayed nothing, but his knuckles were white as he clenched his fists. His wife, his Yara, lay lifeless on their marriage bed, her once beautiful body now pale and still. A deep silence settled over the room as the village healer examined her. He finally turned, his expression grim. She was murdered, he said. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Who would do such a thing? An elder asked. Femi said nothing. He stared at Yara's face, searching for something, an answer, an explanation. But there was nothing. Only cold skin and a question that burned like fire in his chest. Who had done this? As the sun climbed higher, the whispers grew. Some suspected Femi. A warrior with a betrayed heart, a man who had returned to find his wife unfaithful. What greater motive did one need? Others turned their eyes to Leroto, the secret lover. Perhaps guilt had driven him to silence Yara forever. And then there were those who saw something strange in the quiet gardener, the man who never spoke unless spoken to, the man who always watched from the shadows. But no one knew. Not yet. The elders called for an investigation. The village would not rest until the murderer was found. Femi stood at the edge of the gathering, his face unreadable. Somewhere in the crowd, Laroto shifted nervously. And in the shadows, Imani lowered his gaze, his hands trembling, not from guilt, but from something else. Relief. She was finally his. Even in death. The village of Zubari was no stranger to death, but this was different. Murders were rare, and when they did happen, justice was swift. The elders convened in the center of the village, their faces etched with deep concern. Warriors stood guard, their spears pointed toward the sky, as the people gathered, desperate for answers. Femi remained still, his expression unreadable as the questioning began. His grief was silent, but his presence heavy. The village elder, an aged man with lines of wisdom carved into his dark skin, stepped forward. "The wife of a warrior has been slain in her own home," he said, his voice low and steady. "This crime will not go unanswered." His gaze swept across the gathering. "We will find the one responsible." The first suspect, Femi. Femi was the first to be questioned. "You returned from battle to find your wife changed," the elder said, his sharp eyes watching Femi's every move. "Did you know she had taken another man into her arms?" Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some already suspected Femi. After all, what husband could suffer such betrayal and remain silent? Femi's jaw tightened. "Yes," he admitted. "I knew." The people gasped. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth in shock. "Yet, you said nothing," the elder pressed. Femi's voice was steady. What would words change? She had already chosen. The elder studied him. "And yet, you did not leave her. You did not cast her out. Did you, instead, decide to take her life?" Femi's dark eyes met the elder's. "If I wanted her dead, I would not have waited." Silence. The elder nodded slowly. "A warrior kills his enemies in the light of day, not in the shadows of the night." Femi was not yet free from suspicion, but the elders moved on. The second suspect, Laroto. Laroto was brought forward next. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by nervous fidgeting. "You were seen with Yara," the elder said. "Many knew of your meetings. Did you kill her to keep your secret?" Laroto's voice cracked. "No. I cared for her. Why would I harm her?" "Perhaps you were afraid," the elder said. "Afraid Femi would seek vengeance, afraid the village would cast you out." Laroto's hands shook. "I swear, I did not touch her." A woman in the crowd scoffed. "Lies. We all saw how you looked at her." Laroto clenched his jaw. "I did not kill her," he repeated. The elder sighed. "Then who did?" Laroto hesitated. Then, his eyes flickered toward the crowd. "Perhaps it was him," he whispered. The crowd turned. "Imani." The truth begins to unravel. Imani had been standing near the edge of the gathering, silent as always. But now, eyes were on him. The elder beckoned him forward. "Gardener, what do you know of this?" Imani stepped forward slowly. His fingers twitched. He had prepared for this, but now that the moment was here, the weight of it pressed upon his chest. "She was kind to me," Imani said softly. "I tended her garden. She always smiled when she passed." The elder narrowed his eyes. "Did you love her?" Imani hesitated. The wrong answer would condemn him. But the truth could not be hidden forever. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I would never harm her." Femi, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. Then why were you near my home that night? Imani's blood ran cold. A shift in the crowd. You were seen, Femi continued, stepping forward. His gaze was piercing. You were watching. The elder turned to Imani. Is this true? Imani swallowed hard. Aye. His mind raced. He had planned for this, but under the weight of so many eyes, his lies felt weak. I was only passing by, he said quickly. Femi took another step forward. And yet, you were close enough to hear. Close enough to see. A hush fell over the village. The elder spoke again. Imani, did you enter Femi's home that night? Imani's breath hitched. He could feel the walls closing in. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. And then, a voice from the crowd. I saw him, an old woman murmured. All eyes turned to her. She was a widow, known for sitting outside her hut late into the night, watching the village as it slept. I saw him, she repeated, her voice stronger now. He went inside. The villagers gasped. Femi's expression darkened. The elder's face turned grim. Imani, is there anything else you wish to say before we pass judgment? Imani's hands trembled. He could deny it. He could beg for mercy. But the truth had already unraveled. There was no escape. A heavy silence gripped the village. The people of Zubari stood frozen, their eyes locked on Imani. The truth had finally been dragged from the shadows, and now there was no place left for him to hide. The elder's voice was calm, but there was no mercy in it. You have been seen, Imani. You entered the home of Femi on the night Yara was murdered. Do you deny it? Imani's lips parted, but no sound came. His body felt cold, his limbs weak. He had been so careful. So patient. But now everything was crumbling. His gaze darted to Femi. The warrior stood motionless, his face unreadable. There was no fury, no rage, only quiet, solemn understanding. Imani swallowed hard. I loved her. His voice was barely above a whisper. I loved her more than he ever could. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She was unfaithful, Imani continued, his voice trembling. She did not deserve him. She laughed with another man while Femi fought for her, risked his life for her. The elder's eyes remained cold. So, you killed her. A shuddering breath left Imani's lips. I didn't mean to. His voice cracked. I only wanted to talk. I only wanted to make her understand that she didn't need them. Not Femi. Not Leroto. His fingers twitched as if recalling the moment. But she laughed at me. His voice turned bitter. She called me a fool. The village was deathly silent. Imani's gaze dropped to the ground. I couldn't stand it. He inhaled sharply. I put my hand over her mouth. I told her to stop. But she fought me. His hands clenched into fists. She wouldn't stop struggling, and then, she was gone. The words hung in the air, thick with horror. The elder nodded solemnly. You took the life of a woman who did not belong to you. Imani flinched. Femi finally stepped forward. His voice was low, heavy with quiet grief. You took my wife. Imani looked up, his eyes pleading. She didn't love you. She didn't deserve you, Femi. I was the one who truly cared. Femi's fist crashed against his jaw before he could finish. The force sent Imani to the ground, blood trickling from his lip. He gasped for breath, but Femi did not strike again. Instead, he stepped back, staring down at the man who had stolen his wife's life. You are not a man, he said, voice steady. You are a coward. Imani's breath hitched. The elders had seen enough. The oldest among them lifted his staff. Justice must be served. The warriors moved forward. They grabbed Imani, dragging him to his feet. He did not fight back. His limbs were weak, his spirit broken. The crowd parted as they carried him away. His fate had already been decided. The village remained still. Femi turned away, his heart heavy. Yara was gone. Nothing would change that. But at least now, he had his answer. And justice had been done.